Well, as for those of you who've been sitting through the sessions this morning, you know that regulatory issues around the world has been the focus of this morning's conversations, and we've certainly heard from folks from industry from various countries and places in the world talking about regulatory approval programs and development programs and the like in Europe and in Japan and of course in the US. So this panel, to wrap up the morning, kind of tries to bring some of that together and provide some new insights. We have a very distinguished group of folks with expertise from about product development and regulatory issues from around the world, and you can see we've got some of them are representatives of the actual regulatory body. Siegel is actually not a representative of the FDA, though he used to be, but of course very, very distinguished career and experienced in many of these issues. So what I thought we would do in this panel is I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. I'll start, of course, as the moderator by throwing out a few topics and a few questions. I've encouraged the panelists, they are absolutely free to respond to each other and stimulate conversation. And we really want this panel to be interactive. We've got mics in the audience. And I know all of you are here because you want to have the opportunity to either talk directly with folks from the regulatory agencies or people with lots of expertise in the regulatory processes. So please, at any point, raise your hand. I'll recognize you and we'll ask the panel. So with that, I think we will have the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start at the far end with Sowmya.
Hi, my name is Sowmya Viswanathan, and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Biomaterials and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Toronto. I'm also a clinical consultant for translational research and for regulatory affairs for CCRM, and have been leading the cell therapy program at the University Health Network. I also don't represent Health Canada or their views, and they unfortunately are not here because of federal elections, but I've spoken to them, so hopefully I can provide you somewhat of an overview of certainly our experience with Health Canada in a number of these cell therapy products.
Jay?
I'm Jay Siegel. I'm Chief Biotechnology Officer and Head of Science, Strategy, and Policy for Johnson & Johnson. Among my responsibilities there include oversight of our cell therapy programs and currently have floating a proposal to create a regenerative medicine center at J&J to tie together the many small projects and programs and investments that we have and bring together our expertise. Perhaps relevant, as Michael alluded to, I had 20 years at the FDA, including heading biological therapeutics, a role in which I created the cell and gene therapy there and played a central role in the regulatory paradigm of determining what's a 351 product, a 352 product, a device, and so forth. However, thank you for providing my disclaimer. Although I was at the FDA, I do not represent the FDA or have full knowledge of how they'll make any decision.
You're not
As
alone.
I've proven repeatedly.
Yeah.
Yes, good morning. My name is Daisaku Sato. I'm from PMDA, Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Agency. This is a Japanese drug and medical device and regenerative medicine regulatory agencies under the auspice of the Ministry of Health. I have a working experience in the Ministry of Health and PMDA more than 20 years, but I have no experience working in the industry side. So, my office is a office of tissue and the cellular and tissue-based product. This is covering for the biotech product like FDA CBER. So, but the very small scale of CBER, and please don't ask me the very difficult questions in this panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm Jan Kyselovic. I am working as a professor of pharmacology and pharmacy in Bratislava University in Slovakia, Central Europe. My project is usually deal with cardiovascular pharmacology. However, I am also a European expert for drugs, and I'm working as a member of CAT. It means the Commission for Advanced Therapy of European Medical Agency.
Okay, thank you. So it occurred to me as I was hearing the panel this morning, and Jan, you just mentioned that you're a member of the Committee for Advanced Therapies at the EMA, and it occurred to me that it's possible that not everyone in this audience knows exactly what the CAT is and what its role is in terms of evaluation or review of regenerative medicine products. So maybe it'd be useful for you to just give us a quick overview of that.
It will be a pleasure for me to make short introduction of our committee. It is one of the youngest committee of European Medicine Agency. Agency has a top regulatory committee with human medical products, which making any suggestions for European Commission, and European Commission is approval for marketing authorization. And for supporting decisions is EMA created some committee, like for orphan drugs, for veterinary drugs, for medical questions, and also for advanced therapy. Advanced therapy means that we deal dominantly, we are focused on cell therapy, we are focused on tissue engineering products, and gene therapy as well as.
Okay, great, thank you. So just a very general question for the panel to start. From where you sit, perhaps on the regulatory side or in all of your experiences, what do you think some of the biggest challenges are on the regulatory side for product developers? What do you think the challenges are? What do you think these people should be in the audience should be thinking about?
Okay, I will start. The biggest challenge, in my point of view, is prepare the environment for administrative and legislative conditions, which can make easier and faster way to introducing innovative therapy to our patient. It means that we try to, our challenges is prepare something which will be very familiar with activities, developer or small enterprises. The second challenge for me is try to find some possibility for earlier dialogue between developers, company, and regulators. Also, it will be very interesting, and I am sure the European Commission, also European Agency, try to do is find some overlapping activities through health technology assessor networking and also regulation through European marketing authorization. All this question, how to find this easiest dialogue, early dialogue, easiest way, communication, opens all questions, is only one goal, which is our major aim of our agency, is provide for our patient safety drugs, high quality, and also innovative, progressive, and more effective for treatment disease.
Anyone else on the panel want to?
Yeah, thank you very much. There are a lot of challenges in the regulations to deal with the cellular and tissue-based products. And yes, I echo the Jan's comment that there are a lot of small, medium-sized companies and the academias who are trying to make a clinical application of the new products in this field. So our regulatory side have to deal with the scientific consultation to the kind of people who don't have long experience of the regulation in this field. At the same time, technically, the cell therapy product is a very different product from the conventional biopharmaceuticals. And some of the technical guidance cannot be applied to the cell therapy products. So we have to think by ourselves, and sponsors have to think differently. And so it means that we have a larger discretions to deal with the new technical things. This is very high hurdle and very tough challenges for us. Thank you.
Jay?
Well, the development of these products face most of the same challenges that any other biopharmaceutical product does, and more. And I think in the area of most unique, well, not entirely unique, but specific challenges in this space, many revolve around the issue of sameness of the product. Because these products cannot be crystallized or well characterized, that creates many challenges in their regulation and many challenges in their development. How do you know, as you tweak and improve your process, as you upscale it, as you drive down costs, that you have something that for a product for which the data that you generated earlier are still relevant in terms of safety and efficacy. So this gets into, characterization, development of potency assays, comparability protocols, determining how big a change requires how much study, understanding the structure-function relationships, almost every aspect. In fact, at the excellent panel this morning that I got to attend, and I think the rest of the members here participated in.
Thank you.
There was a discussion about, in one of the cases, about orphan exclusivity and its orphan drug policies and orphan exclusivity. I challenge anybody to say how orphan exclusivity is going to apply to this class. When we first started looking at monoclonal antibody orphan exclusivity 20 years ago, basically orphan exclusivity protects you against competition from the same product. Well, we found in monoclonal antibodies, people said, well, there's no value. Somebody could just mutate one irrelevant amino acid, and then they're a different product, and so I don't really have any exclusivity. So we had to figure out how to apply there. And I think in cell therapies that the dimensions of where you source the cells, how long you incubate them, what growth factors you use, all of those things are going to vary. So that's just one of the many issues in which knowing how your product stays the same, when two products are the same or different, are really regulatory and developmental challenges.
Sowmya, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll echo some of the things that the panelists have mentioned. I know that in Canada, certainly the regulators are very open and embracing of cell therapies. They see this as a novel therapeutic, and they want to provide reasonable guidance and not be an impediment to making the therapies come to the market. In Canada, there's the provincial government and the federal government pays for healthcare costs, and there's a lot of cases where people go, for example, stem cell tourism in other jurisdictions and come back, and it is a burden on the healthcare system. So they're very development, so they want to help with this, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty that they face as regulators as well in not really realizing and learning, I think, as the field evolves, where the challenges are and what to focus on and what not to focus on. And it's confounding, as was mentioned, because in many cases the potencies are not very clear and become very clear only later on after clinical trials have actually been completed. Much of this needs to be done in a post-market environment, which is again different from what has been done for traditional pharmaceuticals. And the pharmacovigilance that's been extended has now to actually become longer because many of these cells may engraft or have longer-term potencies. So I think grappling with a changing field and a changing scientific basis and addressing policy issues to be at the same time open to it, but also being reasonable safeguards and have that in place is something I think Health Canada, but I think other jurisdictions are also trying to grapple with.
So I want to pick up on something that Jay, you alluded to, right? Well, you talked about sameness as the challenge, which you talked about characterization, you talked about potency assays, and something that has been a subject of conversation among a lot of ARM companies has been the notion of standards. And something actually that the FDA told us early on about how important standardization was to this field and to the development of the field in terms of scale and manufacturing potency development. So I'd love to know from the panel, I mean, is that your impression also, that the need for sort of more standardization in the field is critical? And I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, which is, so Jay mentioned a couple of topics. Are those sort of the prime topics? And where else should we be looking for that? And I'd love to hear a little more discussion about the issue of standards.
Oh, Mikhail, it's a very important question to standardization. Of course, present evidence-based medicine is built on standardization. It's built on standard guidelines, some standard points. Unfortunately, for regenerative medicine, for advanced therapy, it's very difficult to find any standard. I remember not hours, it's days and months discussion in our commission about some kind of standards which help us as a regulator to make decision. Of course, if regulator has some standard, it's much easier for developers and also for companies to prepare data for us. Unfortunately, we cannot find any standard solutions right now, and then is a question that any guidelines which are using in European Union has most important point. It is personalized, specific evaluation, specific questions, specific process for evaluation any point of authorization process. It means the standard is missing, you are right. Everybody welcomes standards, especially regulators, especially rapporteurs and assessors. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to find any standard.
So do you think there needs to be more actual standards identification and development? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
I see.
So yes, it's very difficult questions because at this point, our regulations review the products, just 4 products, and the very little experience, not many experience of reviewing this kind of product. And the product range is varied from tissue-like things like injectable things, and very large variations exist in the currently available product basis. So it's not easy to generalize the common denominators to make some regulatory standards to that kind of things. So yes, of course, some sort of ICH guidelines and other regulatory conventional guidelines can be applied, most of the things. However, we have to tackle the exceptional things case-by-case basis. And I think this kind of things are very hard challenge for make a standard for this cellular therapy field. And however, at the same time, in the industrial basis, like cell cultures and how to count the cells, and this kind of things, ISO standard can be applicable, and this will help the industrialization of this cell therapy.
Jay, did you want to add anything?
I fully agree with those comments. I think there's a need. We use the word standards. Maybe a better word is the identification and dissemination of best practices, because there are those commonalities, as Sato-san said, and there are. Even though there are product differences, there are commonalities. But even where there's commonalities, we're often working in an area of rapid progress. And standards can support progress, but they can also, if they're too formalized, hold back progress. Right. I remember about 3 decades ago, when a live polio vaccine had to be tested for neurovirulence to make sure it hadn't reverted and caused toxicity. And there was a standardized way to test it. And then one company developed a better way, more sensitive, more rapid, better by all measures. But when they implemented it with the approval of the FDA, they got sued because it was not the methodology that was in regulations. So in a rapidly moving field, we need best practices, and we need to harmonize around those, but still have the flexibility to adapt to specific products and to advances.
Right. Sowmya, did you want to add?
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing, and I think what's happening in the field, is at least for analytical methods, there seems to be more of a consensus between societies like ARM and ISCT, the USP groups that are trying to come up with analytical methods to quantify various quality attributes of the cell therapy products, which, as the panel and everybody knows, is so heterogeneous and diverse in itself that it kind of defies standardization and quantification. But if we can agree on how we're going to say what's good or what's not good, or what is how you identify the cells, and have some harmonization there, then at least we're talking the same terminology and language. And often, even the way cells are called, I mean, we hear about mesenchymal stem cells, we hear them called mesenchymal stromal cells. Even in nomenclature, there isn't any convergence of what you call them. So if we're not even able to call them the same thing, let alone talk about how to characterize and identify them, I think there's ways to go. And I agree, I think this needs to be led by, it needs to be sort of a groundswell rather than something that's top down and imposed, and something that everybody agrees on a consensus basis, and that's developed and has time to be vetted over time, and then percolates up, and then something that the regulators can follow and implement more widely.
Just want to make sure, anybody have any questions or comments about what we've talked about so far? It's hard to see.
Difficult to see.
Not yet. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about expedited approval programs. And I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about expedited approval in your country. Obviously, we've heard comments this morning about Japan's program, so Dr. Sato, you don't have to go into too much more detail. We've heard, but I want to talk a little about that, and I want to sort of ask the panel to think about what those programs are, how they apply to, in Japan's case, it's kind of easy in some ways, but how they apply to regenerative medicine, cell therapy, kind of gene therapy approaches, and whether or not, and how they can sort of be harmonized, or is that not appropriate for any number of reasons. So with that, I'll just start here, John. Okay.
First of all, I have to say that we have no such a program like FDA preparing. I read your documentation, and you have some kind of 4 programs which deal with system. We are continuing our previous legislative steps, but a couple of years we created some innovative task force system, which is like a platform we just created by EMEA through all our structure. And this platform is making especially a condition for micro, small, and medium enterprises which deal, or we are focused on emerging therapy and technology. This platform allows to briefly discuss any question from manufacturing through quality, non-clinical, clinical point of using new medical products for advanced therapies. There is absolutely open possibilities to involve any stakeholders outside from EMEA for this process, and this communication helps, especially to our committee, to prepare a special program or special system for the small enterprises. Also in 2005, EMEA was created office for this micro, medium and small enterprises, which there's dedicated personnel staff which help these small companies practical work with EMEA and also follow some protocols and follow some processes in our system. Then was created in European Union, like slightly opposite, European Commission networking health assessment bodies, which also try to accelerate process through introducing new drugs to market. It is question of stakeholders. The EMEA, the European agency, is just like partner for this discussion, and we create some cooperation in this way. For example, during these 10 years, and now it's in evaluation process, there was about 34 products which was discussed. In this way, 4 was deal with regenerative medicine. It was advanced therapy, medical products. It means a deal with our commission. On the basis of this system, in February 2014 was created a advice pathway for drugs to patient. It means some kind of new pathway how to really accelerate early discussion between any stakeholders. It means there is not just question of EMEA, but it's also national authorities. There is this European networking of health assessors, also some ministries, also some companies, but there also participate some patient organization, plus there could be discussion also with prescribers, with doctors. All this platform is making only not more than 1.5 years. The first stage was try to open some new products. There was question about 33 or 34, I don't remember right now, products. There was 4 deal with our advanced therapy products. The process was finalized with selection. 10 products were selected for next stage. Next stage was very deep discussion. It was 2-4 hours discussion with all stakeholders plus company about how to continue to accelerate process for drugs introducing to the market. The question was 2 scenarios. One scenario is running to make small decisions, approval, then second stage will be increase wide of indications, or second possibility is making conditional approval and then continue with some obligations for company to do next program for developing these drugs. The question right now is that only 6 companies accepted this process and now preparing this scenario and itinerary program for itinerary schedule for next steps. On the basis of these activities, we rebuilt our guidelines for conditional approval, conditional marketing authorization, which will be finalized in the end of this year, and also we start the accelerated process, which is taking much forward contact with companies. Early dialogue could be start 6 months before process, and finally, if this process is accepted by EMEA, the accelerated process take only 150 days to regular authorization.
So just to make sure, did you say 6 products?
Yeah, was accepted such a much bigger process of discussion about products. It means there was a stakeholders, reimbursement. It means there was discuss on the future what will be the drugs in the future done. Okay. With doctors, with patients.
Okay.
Not just for regulation, to
Yeah.
accept it for authorization. It is much bigger discussion.
Okay.
Yes.
Sato-san,
Just make a brief comment on the Japanese cell therapy regulations and the accelerated pathways. The last 3 years revision of pharmaceutical affairs law, the Japanese regulation introduced the third category of product. One is the pharmaceutical, the second is the medical device, the third one is regenerative medical products. This is separate from the drug and medical devices. And for the cellular therapy products, we have a conditional and time-limited authorizations. This is a sort of US accelerated approval, and if the company shows the promising data at phase 2 level, we can approve the product and follow up the safety and efficacy data after the post-marketing phase. That is the system designed for the early access of the patient for the promising therapies. And I think this kind of flavor is included in the European regulation and US regulation as well. And the European has a conditional approval and also the adaptive pathways right now to improve the access for the promising medicines. And also, this Japanese system is a little bit copied from the flavor from the FDA's regulation of the accelerated approval. So I think each regulator thinks about the same kind of things to improve access of the patients for the new therapies, and we are very supportive for the new development.
okay. I know you had talked about.
When listening this morning to the discussions of the various programs, and in the U.S., you know, there's breakthrough and fast track and accelerated approval and the like. All of those programs include many different aspects, and it occurred to me that a way to understand and compare and contrast, it would be easier to get there with some standardization, which is to say, if we had a taxonomy, a way to think about how programs get accelerated. So I actually, if I could take just a couple minutes of your time, I scribbled one while I was listening to the panel. So first, you know, a lot of acceleration is just the sponsor's choice. You skip over phase 2 and guess at the dose and the trial design. You don't wait. You do your definitive trial without before you have your final product and process. So there you have comparability risk. In the first one case, you have dose and design risk. These are sponsors' risks that, at least in the FDA may snicker behind your back and think that you're unwise, but will only say no if you're placing a patient at risk, or if in later trials, if they're inadequately designed to meet the objective of the trial. But when we look at the regulatory pathways and policies, we can divide those into two groups, those that are evidentiary and those that are administrative. Administrative actions can include shorter reviews. In the US, there's priority reviews, saves 4 months. They can include rolling reviews and submissions. Those are in both fast track and breakthrough, speak to the ability to submit, say, the CMC part of the application before you have the final clinical, or the clinical before the CMC, or other major sections, so that the review process in certain cases meeting certain criteria will get a head start. And then increased interaction, which can be very important and and valuable, the so-called all hands on deck approach of breakthrough. The evidentiary areas, how much evidence you need is different from administrative approaches. And there's efficacy, and I divide it into efficacy and sort of everything other than efficacy. So there are cases of flexibility in safety and in CMC that occur when drugs have a large amount of efficacy. So from the view of a regulator, if there's a huge unmet need and there is a major breakthrough in that area, so you have a high degree of efficacy, you can tolerate more uncertainty about safety, uncertainty, lack of precision, lack of large numbers of patients to look at rare events, because the general net benefit to the public is to have that important drug out there before you have all of that precision around safety. And as we've seen breakthrough roll out, you might also tolerate certain CMC risk. You haven't fully validated every aspect of the process. You don't have all the stability data yet, but there's a compelling reason to get the product out. So those are the areas outside of efficacy where there's compelling efficacy. And I think it's a good rule of any regulatory process that everything goes more smoothly if you have compelling efficacy data and an unmet serious medical need. So that gets us down then to the issue of efficacy. And there I would suggest there's 3 different ways efficacy has been approached in acceleration. Endpoints, the rigor of proof, and the breadth of population studied. The breadth of population studied, if you look at some of the approaches in the US recently with antibiotics, if you look at the adaptive pathways in Europe, they talk about allowing smaller, highly focused studies in great unmet need populations like resistant antibiotics with resistant infections, with the notion that post-marketing you may broaden that out, and there'll be a liberalization of standards if you really are focused in on a small subpopulation. The issue of endpoints, so accelerated approval is about use of a surrogate that hasn't been validated, doesn't meet the regulatory standard for acceptance, but is reasonably likely to predict efficacy. And we've seen some interesting things from this space from the FDA about what would be considered a surrogate. In structural disorders, such as, say, retinal degeneration, presumably maybe replacing, we heard an example of a trachea or a heart valve, just structural evidence has been taken not as a surrogate, but has been viewed as actually, well, that's what the disease is, and therefore you don't have to prove some measurable benefit to patients if you've shown that you've improved structure. That's, of course, going to be a case-by-case discussion with the regulator, but it's an interesting view we've heard expressed, for example, in the area of retinal degeneration. And then you get to the area of the rigor of proof. And it was, Ellen Feigl said this morning, the simple answer from the FDA is no, you can't get approved on a secondary endpoint, I think was the question. The actual answer, and excuse me for differing, that's the simple answer from CDER. CDRH is actually different. If your product happens to be a device, they recently approved a device that failed on its primary endpoint based on a patient preference reported outcomes on a secondary endpoint. That's the way, I think, Sato-san, you mentioned your program has a similar flavor to accelerated approval. And maybe modeled on it, but it's an important difference that a lot of people are trying to understand, because accelerated approval is limited to approval with rigorous, 1 or 2 trials, all the same p-values and everything on a surrogate endpoint. What CDRH did, what it sounds like is happening in Japan, is a flexibility that goes beyond just the nature of the endpoint to what you call promising. And I think it'll be very interesting, for example, to see, and I'm sure very challenging for regulators to be consistent about how you define and determine that term. I know our industry in the US has, for certain aspects of our industry, have been looking for that, for a lower standard. There's been legislative proposals that rather than an endpoint reasonably likely to predict, just evidence reasonably likely to predict efficacy, which is a very different meaning. The reality of the world is, though, in most markets, and this was discussed this morning, in most markets, if you don't have the definitive evidence about efficacy, even if regulators will approve you, you're going to face some major reimbursement challenges. So that's something you have to work into your plans, and we'll see how that plays out in Japan and everywhere else. So thank you for letting me take up so much time.
I think that was great. Did you want to add anything, Sowmya?
Yeah, so in Canada, again, there's device, cell therapy products or gene therapy products can be regulated as devices, or they can be regulated as drugs. So depending on which pathway you go, there is conditional market approval for drugs and for devices. For drugs, again, the criteria to qualify for that program is it has to be serious, it has to be an unmet medical need, it has to be potentially life-threatening or seriously debilitating. And if there is some alternative out there, it has to be significantly better than that alternative or decrease the risk compared to the alternative that's already proposed. So if it meets any and all of these criteria, then it potentially can be considered for this conditional market approval. What they'd like to look for is to have statistically significant safety data and promising efficacy data on the expectation that confirmatory trials, which will be done as part of the condition for the approval, will result in statistically and clinically significant efficacy data. So here's where there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of maybe accepting data for using surrogate endpoints, which may or may not be validated. And I think there's more wiggle room, as was mentioned, to accept these for indications which are maybe orphan drugs or pediatric conditions. There is more, I think, leniency or flexibility in accepting those than for other conditions for which there may be drugs out there and that there's a higher burden to meet for that. I understand that for the device side, there is similar accelerated approvals, again, based on very sound safety data and promising efficacy data. But again, that burden of proof that needs to be undertaken in the confirmatory trials may be different for medical devices than it is for drugs. This conditional approval pathway has been in place since 1998 in Canada, and a number of drugs have been approved. And Prochymal was approved conditionally in Canada in 2012 under this same pathway.
I'm going to stop here and see if anyone in the audience want to raise a particular issue about expedited approval. Some of the talks we've been talking about standards, expedited approval, other topics. Okay, well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So Jay, talk for a second. You mentioned reimbursement. We've had lots of discussion about reimbursement at this meeting. We had a panel yesterday where many, particularly U.S. payers, were talking about their timeline and sort of the data they like to see in terms of clinical benefit and the effectiveness of a treatment. And so obviously it poses a challenge to product developers who are trying to appease different audiences without having to trying to do a few studies to appease as many audiences as they can instead of having to do multiple studies. So talk a little bit, please, first of all, about the relationship between reimbursement decisions and regulatory decisions in your particular jurisdictions, and with an eye toward sort of, you have a room full of product developers, so how do you, what's in your experience has been the best way for them to approach this? I'll start with Jan.
Excellent question for Europe. I like this question because it cannot be answered. We have 28 countries, and we try to find some consensus of health policy. But reimbursement and money policy and medical money policy is absolutely different. We have 56 different possibilities. Some countries has 2 or 3 in different regions or provincials. It means the answer to this question for Europe, for our agency, is really absolutely non-relevant. We never thinking how will be next step for company, how will be deal problem with Slovakia, Romania, Germany, England, and really there are dramatic differences. I know, for example, in Slovakia, I could say it because I'm from Slovak, we didn't approve any innovative medicine drugs for reimbursement. Everything is individual process through insurance company. Of course, we are only 5 million people. Then it's very easy to do this way. And it's absolutely different from UK, where it's much more population system. Also, orphan drugs, orphan disease is absolutely different position, etc., etc. It means I cannot answer this question. No strategy for this. We try to do, as I mentioned about these new pathways, advice pathways, there also could be involved some health assessors bodies like Ministry of Health, and discuss this question, but it's not very useful discussion.
So in your mind, company goes two completely
Regulation
isolated. They hire
regulation
different
one.
consultants. They develop different completely
Strategies,
different.
marketing strategies, and everything for each country.
Okay. Sato.
Yes, I don't belong to the payer side of the ministry, but this is my personal opinion. However, I'm sorry to my European colleague. We are the single payer and the single approval system, and these two systems are very consistent in the Japanese regulations. Usually, the regulatory approval of the product was granted for longest 90 days. The payer's decision will be made. This is the Japanese system, and the Chuikyo is one of the body. This is the consultative body of the minister to deal with the pricing of the technology. And I think it's quite easy process. When you get approval, you go to the payer side of the ministry and they negotiate. However, cellular therapy product. Yes, as Mr. Toda mentioned in this morning, 2 products were newly approved. And these new products are now under the discussions of how they are paid by the national insurance scheme. And it was just decided 2 weeks ago that these 2 products will be on the way of the pricing mechanism. So even though this is the conditional time-limited authorizations, but I don't know. I can't expect anything because I'm not the payer side people. How much they will be paid? Many people say that if the size of the indication is very small, the technology is if the technology is very costly, the payer can pay for that kind of disease. However, if this kind of product is used generally in the wider populations, the payer side decision will be different. However, it depends on the product efficacy, which are assessed by the review process of the product.
Okay, any thoughts?
Well, traditionally, and even to the present, the FDA and the CMS, the government payer, are pretty independent. There's been, in recent years, some pilot programs and crosstalk, particularly rather late in the process, at or near the time of product approval, since the FDA often has post-marketing requirements or commitments, and particularly in cases of accelerated approval and in a lot of the expedited pathways we're talking about. And the CMS often has a program that's increased in use, the coverage with evidence development, which they're requiring as a condition of payment additional evidence be generated. And I think companies have realized that optimally, in many cases, it would be better if the regulatory commitments and the payer requirements could be met together. And so there's been some experimenting with actually bringing FDA and CMS to the table at the same time. And I don't know how that's gone, but I do know that's kind of pretty late in the process. The real challenge for developing, and the reality that we face now in all the biopharmaceutical space, is that you need to think about payer concerns very early on in your process, even in designing to value, creating affordable, low-cost devices and products, something very commonly done in the device industry. And then you need to plan your clinical trials to understand not just the regulatory requirements, but the payer requirements, what comparators might they want to see, what endpoints will they want to see, how broad or narrow will the population be, or should the population be? They'd love to see you explore targeting for a variety of reasons. And if you don't do the research then, and it's not through bringing FDA and CMS together, but it is through having expertise or acquiring expertise in what private or public payers will pay for. If you don't build that into your R&D programs, you can have a brilliant regulatory strategy in terms of getting your products approved, but not have a success. So,
yeah, Sowmya.
Yeah, I think that's similar in how in Canada, where post-market. So first of all, there is no single payer system in Canada as well. There are a number of public plans. There are about 16 federal and provincial public plans and any number of private plans. There is an organization called CADET, which does drug reviews, common drug reviews, and oncology drug reviews, and makes recommendations for formulary listings, which the provinces may or may not choose to implement. So as I understand it, and it's fragmented because you may get approval or uptake in certain provinces and may not in others, depending on their budget or their priorities or how they view it. So there is that fragmentation. As I understand it, when a drug gets approved conditionally, it can go up to CADET for review and can get recommended to be listed on the formulary, even though it hasn't met the full market approval conditions. But I think it's interesting that, as you mentioned, Jay, that if the requirements for the confirmatory studies are different from a regulatory perspective than they are from a reimbursement perspective, then it's possible that the developers will meet one but not necessarily the other target. And as a case in point, for example, Prochymal was approved in 2012 but hasn't gone to CADET for a formulary recommendation for whatever reason. So there is no reimbursement, as far as I know, of Prochymal in Canada under any of the public plans. And it could be different from private plans or hospital plans, etc.
So one question that I get from a lot of companies is, okay, we want to take advantage of the Japanese regulatory process, let's say. Or, we're a global business, so we're going to start our trials in Europe. And I'm curious about, you hear that a lot, and then the question that typically comes after that is, well, is that going to help me? I mean, for example, does the FDA like it if I start my trial in Japan, and are they going to look at the data that I generate with a clinical trial there? And they feel the same way about, European regulatory agencies or Japanese or Canadian. So I would just be curious to get the panel's response to that you hear that from a lot of product developers about they're picking where they want to start their trials. So what's the role of data from other trials started in other countries from your perspective?
Okay, there's two very interesting points in medicine. First, how easy is accepted American, European guidelines for doctors. Very easy to accepted strategy for drug treatment, for diagnostic system, any type of disease, hypertension, respiratory disease, and how is problematic to make the harmonization between data or processes. Of course, because Europe is a multinational country, it means we are really open to any type of clinical trials. And we accepted clinical trials as it was done in USA or in Japan or other countries. It means there is no problem. But question is a harmonization of approval process. It means the autonomy of our agency, also specific process required the company has to fill our process scheme and has to prepare exactly document for our agency. It cannot be just shifted from one agency to another agency.
Yes. The acceptability of the clinical data collected in the foreign regions, as long as the ICH guideline compatibles, like GCP, and we accept data for review. But the decision of the efficacy and safety evaluation, it may be different country by country. This is autonomy of each agency's decisions. And also, ICH guideline has the E5 guidelines for the ethnic difference considerations. And in many cases, for the Japanese submissions, we require the Japanese patient data to explorate the medical conditions between the foreign countries and the Japanese countries, Japanese environment. That is one additional things.
Any thoughts on that, Jay?
Well, this is an issue I've been thinking about for the last 25 or 30 years. I was one of the negotiators of the ICH-E5 guideline on ethnic factors and the acceptability of foreign data. I think that the world's come a long way. The standards, the quality standards of how research are done are pretty global, so that is no longer the concern that it was. I know in some circles going back 25, 30 years ago. Obviously, there's divergence, and there needs to be quality control and inspection and everything. But that's not an issue. So then the issue is the relevance of the data, and the E5 characterized differences as intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Intrinsic being like genetic, and extrinsic being like how is the disease diagnosed, how is it treated, what are the concomitant medicines, how severe are the patients when they present, what's happening in their diet and lifestyle. Would it be, for any of those reasons, would it not be applicable to our population? And I think on the one hand, I'd say the global experience has been often foreign data are extremely relevant, but there are specific aspects and many specific cases where they're not exactly applicable. So I think just like in areas outside of regenerative medicine where we've typically been is that Japan has their particular programs for bridging and approaches, but most countries are open to global programs that may be tricky with manufacturing of cell therapies, but many countries require some amount of that global program to be done within their own populations to assure applicability. Often the questions are less geographic questions. Does it work within these geographic boundaries? But they're more questions that have to do with either genetic types or the availability of alternative therapies, the severity of disease at diagnosis. So understanding those factors can help with applicability. The U.S. will look very seriously at data. It has approved products that I'm aware of based almost entirely on European data. I'm not sure if there are examples with other regions, but certainly data from all regions are considered of importance and value.
So as I understand it from Health Canada's perspective, a Canadian trial per se is not required. They will look at data from all regions. And again, there may be some caveats in terms of medical practices, for example, or certain procedural differences, and whether that's applicable in the Canadian context and with the Canadian practice of medicine or with Canadian standards. So as long as there's convergence there or applicability there, they'll look at that. Manufacturing facilities, for example, will need to be compliant with GMP, and the inspectorate may choose to go and inspect the facility, but they will also accept audits from the regulators from that nations, especially if they have reciprocal memorandums of understanding. So as I understand it, they're quite open to data from other countries being presented for product submission.
So we're coming up to the end here, but I'll ask again if anybody in the audience has a question for the panel. We have one.
Oh, hi. Sorry, you all have to shade your eyes. But my question was in relation to looking at autologous therapies and and any kind of harmonization in those respects, also given the individual variations in just efficacy based on genetics and all different types of personal differences.
I think autologous therapy, especially if they are they're minimally manipulated, but they're non-homologous use, is one of the areas where I think there is not convergence between the various jurisdictions. So I know Health Canada, for example, participated in a survey between various regulators and, at an international standard, and this was one area where there was a lot of differences in how each jurisdiction kind of decided how that needs to be regulated, whether that's minimally regulated, doesn't require oversight, or is under surgical practice, or needs to fall under very full regulations. That's where I think there was a lot of differences, and obviously it's a growing area, and there is dialogue and benchmarking in that, and all the regulators are, I think, looking at what others are doing to see if they can harmonize there.
Anyone else on the panel have a comment?
No.
Any last word? Yes, sir. Last question.
Okay, my question is kind of related to this autologous therapy. Got it. Thank you. I have friends who come from overseas, interested in establish maybe a stem cell bank in U.S. So this question probably Jay will give me some information, regarding the regulation. What should I tell them, or where should I get the information in terms of regulatory issues? How to set up, where is the agency to get the information?
And so I didn't catch every word, but there's somebody wants to set up a stem cell bank in the U.S.
In U.S., yes.
And what advice should you give them?
That's why I'm here. I'm paying thousands of dollars.
Well, the single best piece of advice would be to go talk to folks at CBER about the regulatory issues. That's such a broad question. You mentioned manipulation, and I mean there's many different things that you can do with a stem cell bank, and they're going to be regulated under different laws and authorities and rules, and so there's no short answer to that question, as we're a minute and a half over time already. But the Center for Biologics at the FDA has been very open to consultation early on to help people understand the regulatory environment. There are also, and I don't want to get into plugging, but there are also consulting groups that are specialized in blood banks and stem cells and CMC issues that are composed in some cases largely of retired FDA people, and those are the folks to ask those questions to.
Okay, please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.